Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the next session of our Spotlight on GitHub Copilot Study Guide series, Prompt Engineering 300. My name's Anna. I'm an event planner for Reactor, joining you from Redmond, Washington. Before we start, I do have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. Keep an eye on that chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenter to answer. Our session is being recorded. It will be available to view on demand within 24 to 48 hours right here on the Microsoft Reactor YouTube channel. With that, I'd love to turn it over to our presenter. Damien, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Anna, and really good to come back onto this stream to talk a little bit more about GitHub Copilot. Yeah, I can already see some people in the chat launching, telling me where they're coming from. I'm actually in a hotel room in Sydney, in Australia, which is not where I live. I live in Brisbane, Australia, which is much further up the east coast. But I am here for a couple of events, including Microsoft's AI tour. So I have been surrounded by Copilot and not just GitHub Copilot, but a bunch of other Copilots for a while this week. Now, what I want to do today is be fairly loose a bit on the content. There are certainly a few things that I want to go through in terms of making the most out of GitHub Copilot and your prompt engineering. But I do want to make it fairly interactive. So if you do have comments, I'd love you to leave them there. I will check periodically. But otherwise, I want to talk through a little bit about what prompt engineering is and give you some examples. And then I also want to talk a little bit about how do you apply those skills and that understanding inside GitHub Copilot, both with the traditional ghost text kind of Copilot as well as Copilot chat, inline Copilot chat, and also talk a little bit about some extensions and things like that that can really improve the way that you interact with your code using Copilot. All right, so this is the first little piece of information I want to give you. We actually, in GitHub's documentation, have a page about prompt engineering. So you can get to that with gh.io/prompt engineering, and that will take you to our docs page. Now, I'm going to cover pretty much all of this stuff, as well as a few extra little tips as well. But this is a really good resource for your strategies when it comes to interacting with Copilot. Things like, how you pitch your questions, giving examples, breaking complex tasks into simpler tasks, ambiguity, and things like that. Definitely worth a read if you're having trouble or if you just want to improve the way that Copilot responds to you. But we'll go through a few of those and give you some pretty solid live examples of those. All right. Let's start by talking a little bit about what prompt engineering is. And one of the great ways of doing this is by going to OpenAI's chat playground. Now, GitHub Copilot uses some of the same models under the covers. We don't actually send any data to OpenAI. What we do is we use the same models, but inside our own Azure tenant. So this all runs on Azure OpenAI, but it runs inside GitHub's tenant. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One is that we have a lot of control over what goes through that large language model or that foundation model. We can do a lot of things with things like system messages, with other tools and services that we have kind of around the edges, like caching and content protection and things like that. So as an example, if you ask a question of Copilot chat, ultimately it goes up to a large language model that lives in our Azure OpenAI subscription. And then on the way out, we check for, when we get some suggestions, we check to see that there's no security vulnerabilities in the code suggestions that we have given you. And if there are, we strip them away from the results so you won't get those suggested to you. So having them in our own account and our own subscription means that we have a lot more control over what happens with those large language models. We're not just blindly throwing them up and asking for a response. It also means that we can rely on all of the responsible AI and best practices and security practices that Microsoft gives you as part of their OpenAI offerings. because we're not just hosting the model ourselves, we can build on that platform that Microsoft provides to make sure that we have, the security and the responsible AI practices that Microsoft provides on top of our own. So it gives us a lot of advantages doing it like that. So I just wanted to point that out before we start using the chat platform in OpenAI to explain a couple of things. All right. So the practice of prompt engineering is really about how you communicate with a large language model. And in this case, there are some services around, before we get to the large language model and after, but the same kind of concepts apply. So as an example, I'm in Sydney. I don't come from Sydney. So if I asked a question like, can you tell, you can see this is live because I'm making typos, tell me about Sydney. And the response I get will likely be quite long and tedious. What are we on? GPT-4o, and a little bit slow at the moment, which is not ideal. Maybe I can switch models to see if it'll be a little bit faster, or refresh the page. Great. Let me just quickly authenticate again. I'm not sure why it's logged me out. Cool. Bear with me 1 second. This was working all right before. So what I really want to do here, cool, that's not going to work very well. All right, let's do it a different way. Let's just go straight to Copilot in Visual Studio Code. So one of the things about Copilot, and I still demonstrate the same things here, but one of the things about GitHub Copilot is that it only wants to answer questions about code. So if I said something like, can you tell me about Sydney? It's likely to say, sorry, I can't assist with that, because it's not a programming question. Now, I'm not suggesting that you do this, but obviously because we are having some issues with the OpenAI playground, I'm going to do this. I'm going to say, can you, let me just do this, hold on. City, by the way, you can do this if you want. It's not ideal. And I wouldn't recommend it in production, but I could say something like, fill out the JSON file I have here with details of Sydney. All right, let's see how that goes. Oh, no, still not working. All right, let's just use ghost text. So the information I'm getting here is, Sydney is the state capital of New South Wales, most populous city in Australia. So there's a lot of information here. But what I was really after was just, the highlights or the tourist information. Giving additional context and saying, this is kind of what I want, gives me the ability, or gives me, a more specific response. So rather than just saying, hey, tell me about Sydney, which is what I would have done in the chat, here I'm asking it to fill out a JSON file with, just general details. By saying, information, it gives me something broad. By narrowing that down to, an item called tourist locations, it gives me, a more specific response. We can also change the model that it's using if we're using chat. But sorry, I'm just going to narrow down on here. I could do something like, well, there you go, there's a website. So now that's kind of the example we've given it. And this is one of the other tips, is to give examples so that Copilot knows, the exact kind of information you're after. And you can see after that, it's filled out some more details, but it knows what that object that I want looks like. It knows that it wants a website on top as well. So we're getting much more specific about what we're after here. I'm going to do one more thing, which highlights that, and you would have seen this as well with the website. It's likely to just kind of be guessing based on the name of the location, but obviously this is information that needs to be looked up on the internet. Now, this comes from training data. It's not doing a search for, the most popular locations in Sydney right now. So it's important to understand that this is all based on kind of training data. When you ask for code as well, that's what it's basing it on for the most part. There is other context you can give it. So here we're giving examples of the JSON we want. And when you're working in code, it will give you, it will pass up information about the code that you're looking at too. I'm just going to have a really quick look to see if this is going to work for me, because there's a couple of things I'd love to show you here. I'm wondering whether StreamYard is deciding it's not going to let auth through, so nothing gets captured. Guess not. All right, so we're not doing that. One thing which is actually really handy with GitHub Copilot is if English is not your first language, that can actually be not beneficial to you, but it means that you don't have to work in English if that's not the way you want to work. So I'm going to switch to some actual code to show you what I mean, and say, if I was to say to verify an Australian phone number, spelled wrong, it will give me a regular expression to test that phone number. But if this is not kind of my natural language, I could say, I'm just going to do this and show you another little tip. Let's grab, make it an array, and then say English is this. There you go. So if my normal language is Spanish, or my native language is Spanish, then I could say this. And because large language models in general are multilingual, I guess, especially GPT-4o and 3.5 Turbo and the ones that we tend to use for ghost text, it understands what I'm talking about. Now, this goes even further if I say something like, if I want to explain that code. Now, you can do this a couple of ways. You can come over to your chat and say, explain. It's not that one. Explain in the workspace. And it uses the reference of the file that I've got and says it's a TypeScript function that, validates Australian mobile numbers in regular expressions. But once again, if English is not your natural language, you could say, in Spanish, and the response will come back in Spanish. So super handy if English is not your first language. You can just work with Copilot in whichever language you want and get working code and understand the code. I want to talk a little bit about how you can get the most out of this ghost text function. So there's a few surfaces that Copilot shows up in. The first one, which we released, kind of first up, was this ghost text or autocomplete function. Now, the history of Copilot's kind of fascinating. It was back about, I think it was 2021. Speaking to some of the people from the GitHub Next team, which is our research R&D arm, basically, which is where Copilot came from, they said that what used to happen in that team is every 6 months or so, somebody would bring up the idea of a general purpose, code generation tool. And every time it came up, they'd look into it and say, look, the technology's just not really there. In about 2021, they got access to GPT-3 at the time. Now, GPT-3 was kind of the turning point, I guess, for that discussion, where they gave it a bunch of programming problems to test it. And these were standalone, isolated problems. And out of the box, it got about half of them correct. It would produce runnable, executable code that solved the problem they'd asked for. And pretty soon, with some tuning and some, determining how it worked, they got that up to about 90%. So they were experimenting with this, and they kind of thought that this idea of Copilot Chat, this chat box that you have over here, is a good way of surfacing that. Until somebody suggested, well, actually, maybe we follow the ideas of autocomplete and IntelliSense and things like that, and see if we can embed it in the editor. And from that point, they realized that was a much, much nicer and more interactive kind of paradigm. So that was the first version of Copilot came out as that tool rather than as chat. Now, as the chat got better and as these foundation models got better, and of course our own tuning and making sure that it was relevant to code and things like that, as that got better, we brought back chat. So chat can give you information about what you're looking at and describe what's going on. And it's got a few more capabilities I'm going to talk to in a second as well. But Importantly, that first way that Copilot was surfaced was not chat, even though that was the first idea. It was this ghost text interactive situation. So a few ways that you can make sure you get the best out of ghost text. One is that the more information you give it, so if you get specific, you start getting specific about what you need, then the better it's going to be. So that example before, validate an Australian phone number. Actually, let's start with this. Validate a phone number. If I did just that, it would say, great, it's some kind of number. I'm not great at reading regular expressions, but I think that's a collection of numbers between 10 and 14 digits long, basically. But if I wanted to be more specific with an Australian country code, then the result it's going to give me is much better. So it's either 610 or 61. So 61 is the Australian country code, followed by the number of digits. Now, as well as being more specific, you can giving examples is an incredibly good way of getting things from Copilot. So if I said the format, it's even predicted what I'm going to do, but it's +61 4111111. Yeah. That. So that's the kind of format that we often use, I guess, in Australia. And it has done the right thing? Not quite. Let me see if I can specify even more. There we go. So I just had to kind of tweak that prompt to get it to give me exactly what I wanted. But what I've done is give it an example of what I want. Now that's incredibly useful just for functions and things like this, but it's also incredibly useful for things like JSON. You saw before we gave an example of what that JSON should look like. And it used that information to give the result that I wanted. Now, this is a really isolated kind of self-contained function that we're asking for, but this happens more broadly as well. So if you are using good coding practices and things like consistent naming in your files or in your projects, then you're going to get better, more aligned results from GitHub Copilot as well. So if my functions were named something like this, is phone number, lowercase, what is it, camel cased functions, then the rest of the suggestions are going to be similar as well. So if I wanted to validate an email address, you can see is email is the way it's done. But for example, if I said, this is the way I name my functions in this file, because that gets used as context, you can see it's now named that function similarly. So think about this in a broader sense of if in the rest of the file, the rest of your project, you work in a particular way, Copilot follows those patterns. So the more consistent and the better coding practices and standards you have, the better the results you're going to be. Okay, one other tip. So if you're consistent, it certainly helps. If you have good coding practices, that certainly helps as well. One other tip that I have in here is generally, like, this is a very small self-contained function. But if I wanted to say, give some more behavior, breaking it down into smaller problems is much easier than trying to define everything you want that function to do. So let's say I wanted to validate an Australian phone number with that country code, but then if it's incorrect, I wanted to call to another function to try to fix that phone number. So let's just put in a function fix phone. There you go. And so there's a function to fix that phone number. So if I wanted to use that function, rather than saying all of that up here, which will probably still work. So let's try it. Let's just do that. If the phone number is invalid, not return false, use the fix phone function to remove the spaces. So now you can see I've asked for a lot of things here. Oops. I've asked for a lot of things here, and it will probably get it right. Well, no, it didn't. There you go. So I've kind of given it too much in one go, and I'm asking it to do a lot of different things. The way that Copilot tends to behave then is either to give you a bit at a time, or just to kind of not get the result that you want very well. So I've accepted that first one. It hasn't done a great job. I'm kind of giving it too much scope, too many things. So one technique that you can use is to just break it down into smaller parts. I'm just going to take a detour here because I can see what it's done. It's not getting this one right, and sometimes that happens. Large language models and AI tools like this are non-deterministic. You can't always get the result you want. So there's a few things you can do here. One thing to note is that when Copilot returns a response, it returns more than one often. So if you hover over its ghost text with your mouse, you can see this is suggestion 1 of 3. I can skip through the suggestions and say, well, that is that one better? I don't even know. This one's very specific about the area code too, which is good. So I can skip through them and say, oh, I like that one, I don't like that one. You can accept all of it with tab, which is standard, or accept just a word at the time. Or you can show this completions panel. You can also do that by doing, I'm on a Mac, so Control Enter, but I think it's Control Enter on a Windows machine as well. But if we open that completions panel, we can see all the suggestions that it's given us, including some extras. So in this case, we've got a few suggestions. This one's 9 characters, this one's 9, this one's 9 or 10. This one is in set to 3. So this is probably the one I want, and I think can accept that suggestion too. So Control Enter if it's not giving you exactly what you want, or you can hover over the ghost text and hover over the ghost text and it will give you those suggestions. I think there's a shortcut for those too. So I think it's next. There you go. So in my case, it's option right square bracket. So it's probably similar, alt square bracket or something in Windows. So there are shortcuts you can use for that if you really want to be a power user. But Copilot will return multiple results. It'll show you in ghost text the first one. But if you want to look at the other options, you can either do that or you can do Control Enter and it will open that completions panel to show you what the other options are. All right, that was a bit of a detour, just because I saw that happening and I thought it was a good spot to mention it. This Australian country code, what we wanted to do is if it's incorrect, we wanted to use this fix phone function. So fix phone to remove spaces. And now we have this this additional requirement. But because we've broken it down into here's what I want initially and here's what I want after that, we get kind of better results. So breaking bigger problems down into smaller ones is definitely helpful. We see some examples of people, opening a brand new file and then typing the description of what they want in that entire file. Sometimes it works fine, sometimes it doesn't. I think it's much, much easier or much better to use Copilot in small chunks. The other thing that I like doing as well is if you're just typing, so you say export function, I don't know, is email address, and it starts filling things out. If that's not exactly what I want, I can just keep typing. That's generally how I work with it. So I start, pause for half a second to see what it's suggesting, and if it's right or mostly right, I'll accept that suggestion and then delete what I don't need and continue from there. Or I'll just have a glance and say, no, not quite right. I want something else. Keep typing, pause again, and see where it comes up. So just continuing to type is a good method of working with ghost text as well. All right, I want to switch a little bit to Copilot chat and inline chat. But before I do, I'm just going to jump back to the comments just to see if anybody has any. Oh, yeah, there we are. Over here. Cool. All right. Oh, there's quite a few. Cool. I think it's likely to be. Okay, so enjoying the code auto-generated for repeated test assertions and a bunch of other repetitive code snippets. I will show you the tests stuff in a second. Cool. Dev challenge, express your love for your significant other as a JSON snippet. That's pretty good. Bonus points if you encrypt and provide the key on Valentine's Day. That seems like the kind of thing that you could absolutely do with Copilot. I feel like you probably need a equally nerd partner, which is great. Okay, so there's not really any questions there, more like are these things you can do. Testing though was mentioned, so I'm just going to jump back and show you I think what was meant. Also as an introduction to Copilot chat. So we've seen kind of this surface of Copilot, which is the ghost text, and a few techniques for looking at that and getting you know best results from that. But if I wanted to do some tests for this is phone number, one thing that's really good at is writing tests around a particular function. So Copilot actually does really well with these tests. What you can do is highlight the code, and there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can highlight the code and come over. Somebody's ringing my hotel room, which is great. You can just come over to chat and say, tests, and it will use the content that I've highlighted as a prompt as well. So what's really interesting, if we zoom in a little bit here, hopefully that zoom works, but if we zoom in a little bit here, we can see that this is the current file context. This is a new kind of UI pattern that got added really recently to show you what explicitly some of the context that's coming up. Now, this is not an exclusive list of all of the additional information that's being sent up to get some good results, but this gives you a really good example of like, this is the current main piece of information that I care about. So in this case, it's looking at line 9 through 13, because that's what I've highlighted. And obviously, if I change that, it's going to change the lines that it's going to send up as specific content. So here, if I wanted to say, write some tests for this function, it knows this is exactly what I'm talking about, and it will make some suggestions. So in this case, it's set up a plan and given me some code to do that. Now, because it's a test, because we've asked for a test, it's clever enough to say, well, you probably don't want that right here in this code. You're going to want it in a different file. So here's my suggestion in a utils.test.ts file. If I wanted to do that, I can apply those edits. Now, applying edits is a new kind of behavior as well, where it's a little bit smarter than just pasting it in. It will apply them to the current file or the current project. So if I wanted to say, yep, that looks great. Sorry, let's apply those. We'll see it create a new file and write all of those files in there. It also says, which is really cool, we recommend installing the Jest extension. And it's even given me a link to inside Visual Studio. So Copilot can work not just with the code that you're looking at, but it gives you the ability to kind of talk to other services. We'll come back to that because that's really important and helpful when it comes to getting the most out of your software. Okay, let's just save that file. Actually, you know what? Let's not bother. This is all just a test project anyway. Okay, so we can write tests that way. Now, this was code. This was Copilot chat. You can also do this with inline chat, which I like doing if I'm talking about a specific piece of code. And to do that, you do Command or Control I. And it basically right in line, it tells you, it asks you what you want to do. That shortcut, sorry, I realize I kind of skipped over that, but that is a slash command. Now there's a few of these that exist in a number of different contexts. So in this case, a slash command, it's really just a shortcut for asking Copilot to write some tests for this stuff that I've highlighted. And I think that's ultimately how it works under the covers too. Just saying slash tests actually sends information up to Copilot. Exactly, pretty much the same as if you said, can you write tests for this function? And it will do a really similar thing. Yeah, it's actually even suggested using slash test. So it's done the same kind of thing, but we were a bit more explicit about it. Oops. Let's just close this. That's all. That's it. So you can do it with inline, and you can do it with the normal chat. Some of these other slash commands are really good. So documentation for the symbol is really good. It uses the language that you're in as well as kind of context for how you do those comments. So if you're working in a JavaScript file, it's going to give you a different format for comments than if you're using Python. So not just what the comments look like, as in what's your escape symbols for comments and things like that, but also the way that you tend to do that in those languages. So for Java, it might structure that function comment in a particular way versus Python. It'll do it in a different way. Explanations are really good inline as well. I actually prefer these in the Copilot chat window directly. You can do them right here, and it's explaining how this works, but it tends to just spin up a whole lot of text. And in the end, I end up just clicking view in chat anyway, so you can read it. All right. Let's clear all of that and come back. So that's Copilot chat. I want to drill in a little bit to that context that it gives. So I'm highlighting this context here. But if I was to want to use some other part of my code, I can specifically give it context as well. There's a few ways to do that. I could say, this paperclip icon to say attach context, and it will give me some options of other things that I want to send up. So what's really happening here is behind the scenes, Copilot in general will try to collect valid information to send up to the server to say, I've asked this question, but here is some additional information that is relevant. Now, by default, it uses things like the current open file, other open files that you have in your editor here as well. So in this case, if I asked a question, it's likely to also use this untitled content as well as context because I have that open. The exact way that it decides what information is relevant and will go up to the server is something that is kind of proprietary, but it's also mainly because it's experimented on constantly. When we try to get the best results out of Copilot, one of the key ways that we measure that is by measuring the acceptance rate. So when we build a certain collection of content by looking at the extra files, maybe we decide to look at the names of the functions in the file you're in. That model that kind of builds that context to send up is being experimented on constantly to try and get that acceptance rate up. So acceptance rate is just Copilot gives you an exception, and a suggestion. Do you accept that suggestion or not? And then even later on, is that suggestion still there, or did you accept it and then just delete it all? We don't actually store what the request and the exception is, and the suggestion is, unless you allow us to do that in your settings. And that's only a setting that you can set for Copilot individual at the moment anyway. If it's Copilot Business, that license, or Copilot Enterprise, we will never use that information, the actual prompt and the suggestions we've given you back. So in general, like we don't use the code that you send up or the context you send up as we don't store that information and use that information beyond just we constructed the prompt in this way and we got this kind of acceptance rate. This is a better way of constructing the content that we send up to give me suggestions, if that makes sense. That was a little bit rambly, but the idea is that we automatically build that context and send it up to get the best results. But you can tweak that by saying this is relevant context as well. So back to this, if we attach some context, we can attach an entire code base. We can attach what's in the current editor, the selection. We can even, in certain languages, give symbols. So it's a little bit beyond just, what are we looking at here? This is travel. So we can say the actual function or the actual method that we're using in specific languages. It understands enough to be able to say, oh, this is a function, that's the thing you care about. And we can send that symbol up specifically rather than just the lines of code. We can also say things like, the terminal, the last command we used in the terminal in Visual Studio Code, or what we've selected in the terminal. In Codebase, we're basically saying use the entire Codebase as context for this. Now, obviously, code bases are going to be larger than what you can send through to a large language model. So it's going to be a little bit intelligent about what it cares about in that code base as well. The other way you can do this is just by hitting hash in the chat, and you can do this in inline chat as well. But I quite often do this to say, look, the relevant file that I care about is, I don't know, page dot, or was it footer.tsx or something like that. And by referencing that specifically, it knows that, when I'm asking the question, I'm talking about that specific file. So by way of example, I'm going to stop doing this kind of project, and I'm going to say something like, can you tell me about the graph defined in on-time line chart, which is a line chart that's part of this travel application that we're running. Now, because I've specifically mentioned this file, even though I don't have it open, I'm not looking at anything relevant, it will send that up as specific context. And it uses that as a reference to give me information about that. This can be really handy if you're doing something like trying to get information about a specific function, or how different functions behave, or how different files behave. Or it can be really good to say things like, hey, have I tested, like if I'm in a test file, have I tested all of the functions in, and you name another file. That's kind of the stuff that I use it for most frequently. So yeah, hash and then just typing the file name, it'll find it for you. What else have we got? So that's kind of referencing specific files. The other thing that I want to talk about is extensions and participants. So as well as the hash, which gives you a specific reference to something else, you can say @. And @ gives you access to basically a set of agents. And this is agents in the broader sense as well, the idea of like this agentic tooling. So Copilot chat is really good at certain things. It's really good at writing code and examining your project and things like that. But some of these agents and extensions are good at other specific things. One I want to call out is @workspace. I use this one all the time. @workspace basically says, in my entire project, can you give me this information? So I could say something like, where do we define the, I don't know, authentication in this application? And that's a really broad question that normally is something that you would ask an expert for. That was a bad example. Okay, workspace, where in this project do we have tests? I'll see if that one gives me something better. There you go. Tests are located in the test directory. So far, there's only admin. Well, for example, there's admin travel guide test, and I can click into that and see, here are the tests that are in here. So this is something that you would normally kind of have to rely on an expert in that code base to ask the question. Whereas because Copilot, or because GitHub especially, in this case, has indexed all of the code on the server, it can give me that information. Now, even if it hasn't indexed all the code on the server, let's say you only have all of this locally, it uses its best effort to try and work out what references are valid for this question. So let's do another one. We can say, workspace, can you tell me about the tech stack for this project? Now, it's using a bunch of references to try and work that out. I'm going to drill into them in just a second, but it uses the following tech stack. It's React, Next.js, Tailwind, Recharts, Launch Darkly for feature flags and stuff. That's actually really an incredibly good answer. But the way it works that out is by using these references. When I asked that question, it said, well, what's going to be relevant in this entire workspace, this entire project, to answer that question? Dev container JSON is really handy. That's the definition of the dev environment that I need if I wanted to use code spaces or something like that. We've got Copilot instructions. I'll get to that in a sec. The git ignore file is actually very useful for finding out that information. We've got some fonts for some reason, so sometimes that's a little bit of a miss. Components, JSON, Babel config. So it's using this information to try and find out the answer for me. And then based on that, it's come up with a really, really good answer, actually. So that's @workspace. @workspace has a number of other / commands itself. So it's basically saying, do this thing for the entire workspace. One that's quite cool is new. So workspace new, you could say something like, can you give me a view app for, I don't know, calculating tips in the US, for example. And what that does is it says, well, not so much this workspace, but for a project, here's an entire directory structure for an application, and it gives me this folder, this directory tree, and you can create it right from here. And the way that actually works, I'm not going to do it because it'll create it and then switch me to that, and I'll get out of my demo. But the way that works is it does multiple round trips and says, this is the application I want to build. It's in Vue. What's the directory structure? Like, what would I need to be able to implement that? Pulls down or creates this directory structure. And then if I say create workspace, it uses that information plus my original request to ask Copilot to fill in each of these files, given the other relevant files and so on. It's actually incredibly powerful doing this. Yeah, so try that one out. So that's Workspace. Workspace basically lets you look through your entire workspace, or it gives you a way of creating a new workspace and things like that. One of the other, we call these participants because they're kind of just built in, is the GitHub participant. Now, this is really useful for, it says right there, get answers grounded in web search, code search, and your enterprise's knowledge. So this calls up to GitHub and can also call out to the web. So if I was to say something like, what's the latest version of .NET, knowing that they released a new version really recently, it even says, look, this looks like a recency thing. I'm going to need to look this up on the internet. And so it's done a search for latest version of .NET and has returned that information. So that GitHub participant has acted as an agent to determine a better way of getting that result. If I was to just ask that question, like, what's the latest version of .NET, straight in Copilot, it's probably going to get it right because we just asked that question in this chat. And I didn't. There you go. And that's because it's not looking things up on the internet. It's just using its trained knowledge and its knowledge base itself. So it's got that wrong. Using that at GitHub participant can be really handy for that. It's also handy for saying things like, what are the open issues for this repository? Because I'm working in a Git repository that's up on GitHub, it can use that information to say, well, here's the open issue for the repositories, and the open pull request has even provided that. These are also deep links to those issues as well. So if I clicked on that, I go all the way to the issue and so on. You can do things like, so this is issue number, let me just hover over that again, issue number 2. Can you summarize what I need to do for issue 2? And again, it uses that information, but because we're working with a large language model, no, that didn't work. Let me just try one more time in this repository. This has worked recently. So, well, there you go. Okay. By the way, one of the side effects that I get working at GitHub is I get really early builds of all of this stuff. I'm using Copilot VS Code Insiders, which is like the nightly build. I'm also using kind of pre-release builds of Copilot and also kind of channeled into some of the experimental stuff. So sometimes while things are in flux, these suggestions don't work. So don't read too much into that. It's very likely to work for you. So that's the other participant. You can see if I do there's a bunch of other ones as well. So terminal is another participant. It means doing things in the terminal over here. VS Code is questions about VS Code, like how do I change the theme, is really handy for working within VS Code. So in this case, and it's as well as that, it's really easy to perform that task. So I can go straight to the command palette. I can search the extension marketplace by clicking there. So it gives me kind of actionable things to do. All right, so those are the participants, or those are some participants. I also want to talk about extensions. So for example, I use LaunchDarkly in this application, which is a feature flag service. And I can talk to LaunchDarkly to say, create a new flag for me for this test application. And this is an extension that LaunchDarkly has provided that I can install by going to the GitHub Marketplace. And what that does is it allows me to reach out to LaunchDarkly and perform tasks with that third-party service. And that can be pulling information back, or it can be performing actions as well. I'm just going to stop that one so I don't actually create these. The Azure one is really good, but unfortunately can't show you that because I'm just, with this account, I've lost access to the Azure tenant, which is a whole thing. But one of the really, really good ones is Azure cost, and it will break down the incurred costs of Azure resources and show it to you in chat, which is incredible. You don't have to go out to Azure and do that as well. So those extensions are all available on that marketplace. We can have a quick look at that marketplace. Oops, sorry. We've got a little thing there, but if you go to github.com/marketplace, you can see under Copilot, you can see all of the extensions that are available. So there's ones for Docker, Perplexity, Stack Overflow, Mermaid charts, GitHub models, a whole bunch of these, which can be really, really handy. So you can still work within GitHub Copilot, but talk to these third-party services as well. All right. I'm just going to check the chat again, sorry, before we go on, because I want to talk about some of the newer features that we have in Copilot 2. So let me just quickly check that chat. Thank you. Greetings from email regex doesn't handle plus correctly in email addresses. Yeah, so that's an interesting point actually from Noel. The email regex doesn't handle plus correctly in email addresses. That's a good example of where you, as the developer, being the pilot and Copilot being the co-pilot, if you are aware that that is a thing that needs to happen, you could specify that in your comment. Now, because Copilot, just like all AI tools, is non-deterministic, you're not 100% sure that you're going to get the correct answer or the answer that you want. You have to be a bit more specific about that. So in that case, if I was like, well, we need pluses in the email address, I could specify that specifically and say, make sure you're allowed pluses in the email address, and the response would come back probably with that as well. How can GitHub Copilot write web accessibility tests? Specifically, I don't know, but I want to show you really quickly because there's a couple of things I want to show you. I don't want to run out of time, but let's say we go to a page.tsx for our profile, user profile, for example. I don't know who left that comment in the bottom. And we wanted to make sure that this was actually an accessible page. What we could do is open chat and say, does this page meet accessibility standards? And what could I do to... Again, it's using that current page as the context. And if I didn't want to, I could click this little eye icon to disable that. But it will say, to make sure that it does this, consider these improvements, and then gives me some examples as well. So this is, it's a bit less, am I running some tests, and more like, here are the recommendations. But you could say something like, can I create tests to test for these things? And it's likely to give me a way of doing that, including any libraries I need and things like that. So you can treat Copilot Chat as a semi-expert on a bunch of different things. It's not always going to give you the exact right answer, but here in this case, it said suggesting the jest testing library, and then making sure that the avatar renders with the alt attribute, and then there's a username, current status, and so on. So it's kind of trying to help you out with that as well. So that's just an example of that. I'm just going to switch back to see next questions. Sorry, Anna. I know I kept doing that. Catching up to cursor, cool. A couple of accessibility Copilot extensions in the marketplace. So Ally and Kylan. So thank you, Robot, for that one. Yeah, have a look at those ones. Does GitHub Copilot have an API if we want to automate some tasks? The short answer is yes, but it's not publicly accessible. So effectively, no. The only way to really access GitHub Copilot is either through Visual Studio Code or the JetBrains suite, or Visual Studio, or any of the other IDEs or editors that use it, or Copilot Chat in .com. So let me just quickly show you that is a thing that exists. So if you can jump back to my screen, you can see you can get Copilot chat, available in .com as well. So this is, in this case, it's not looking at a specific repository, so I can ask a general purpose chat, what are some feature flag libraries, and it will give me that kind of same result as well. So I can talk to chat in .com. There is also the ability to talk about specific specific repositories and things like that. So this Copilot chat in .com also looks at the context as well. So if I looked at, let's say this one, and I was looking at a specific issue, I could say, let's just do a new chat. And we're chatting about this specific repository now, and say, it's even giving me a suggestion, summarize this issue. And, it will read through all the comments and give me a suggestion of, or give me a summary. So here you go. Oh, and it's just restricted that. Let's try that one more time. I don't know why that response would have done that, but it did. All right, so here's the title, here's the description, and so on. Were there any decisions made? So I'm kind of talking to my project here, and because I'm in this issue, that context that I'm working with is the issue itself. Now, this works with pull requests and issues and specific code that you're looking at in the browser as well. So yeah, it's given me information. I can talk about that. So that's kind of the other surface that it appears as well. All right, one more quick chat to see whether there are any other questions, and then I want to show 2 more features that I really love. Okay, no more. So let's switch back to code, and I want to show you 2 more features that are really good. Let's close these ones that I'm not using anymore, and say, so in this application, let's just see if it's running. Clear npm run dev. See if it's actually going to run. No, npm 20. Sorry, using the wrong version. Run dev. Okay, and it should work on 3000. Let's do that. Switching back to a browser. So this is the application that we're working in. This is a Copilot Airways, and over here we have our profile page, and you can see, we've got this table of information here, but it'd be really good if that was a graph underneath. So to do that, we're working in React. I would probably want a new React component which shows that graph so I can use it elsewhere as well. I need to edit this profile page. I need to probably write some tests around it. I might want to update the README. So there's a bunch of different files that I'm likely to need to change. Now, I can do that with Copilot just traditionally by doing it one file at a time, or even in chat asking what I need to change, and it's likely to give me a bunch of different suggestions. But there's a new feature called Copilot Edits. And this allows you to kind of define a set of files that you want to work with, or even just give it some information, and it'll work with a bunch of different files. So we are on that profile page now. So that working set, the files that we're editing, includes that one as well. We can specifically add new files and say, we want to edit this file and this file as well. Or we can just use, text to say something like, I need, hang on, can you write a new reusable graph to display, graph component to display the points activity. And then I can be more specific as well. So can you make it look similarly to, and then again, specifically asking, I know that there's an on-time line chart, like a line chart that I use elsewhere. And then, put it below the table on the profile page, write some tests as well, and update the README. And so even though I'm not specifically calling out that README, I could. So yeah, we're asking basically for a bunch of changes that we want in one go. The other thing which I haven't showed you yet is this. This is new. This is the model picker. So by default, we use GPT-4o, but for certain tasks, I might want to choose which large language model I want to use. I personally quite like using Sonnet, Claude Sonnet. So it's not just an OpenAI collection. We've got Google and we've got Anthropic as well. I quite like Claude for multiple file edits. I don't know. I think I just like the way it behaves. But this is kind of your preference as well. We're giving you the choice of the model to use. All right, let's kick that off just so it doesn't take too long. And while we're doing that, I'm going to point out, well, let's let it do its work. It is going to walk through what it's going to do. It's going to create a new chart component. It's going to add the component to the profile page, create tests, update the README, and you can see it generating these edits kind of in real time. So this is important because it's not just editing the file I'm in or the context I'm in. It's saying across this entire project, here's how I solve the problem. And it's going to take a number of updates. So let's see where we are. All right, so we've got an update to the page itself. It's taking a second. Oh, that's interesting. Update to the page, hasn't done that at all. I'm just gonna try doing that again. Bit weird. It's updated the README. It's not showing me these updates, which is fascinating. And then, so it's modifying all those files. I can skip through them individually and see what the changes it's made are. Or I can use this little button here to show all of the edits in one, in one location. So all of the files and the changes kind of on top of each other. Let's see if this is going to work for me. Yeah, this is a bit weird. All right, let's discard all of that. I'm going to just do this. We'll try it one more time. Oops. We'll do a brand new one. Let's try it one more time. I need to just reference this specifically again. One-time line chart. Great. I'll try one more time. If that's not going to work, I'm going to blame the fact that I'm on insiders and pre-builds and all sorts of stuff like that. But normally what you would get is the changes to all of those files in here, kind of in a diff mechanism. So everything that's new is green highlighted and everything that's old is red. So you can see the actual changes, just like if somebody had submitted a pull request or something like that. Okay, this seems to be going better. Not sure what that hiccup was. So we can see in that page TSX, it's made this change. We can see it's added that chart to the bottom here. If we go to README, we can see it's added a bunch of lines down the bottom about the components that we're using. But if I wanted to see all of them in one hit, I could go over here and say, well, here's that change. That looks good. Here's the profile page. Here's the points activity chart. And here is the README changes. I can say I want to save all of these. I want to accept all of those changes. And with any luck, if I refresh this page, there we go. We've got points activity trend. Yeah. So we can see it's created that graph and modified a bunch of different files as well, just with that one Copilot edits page. All right, we are quickly running out of time. I want to show you one more thing, which is custom instructions. So if we look at this launch darkly service line that it's added to this activity chart component, that's not something that Copilot would normally come up with itself. That's something that we want to do for our project. We always want this feature flag in here. To do that, we've got a couple of ways of doing it. There is a new way of doing this with Copilot instructions. So you can include a markdown file in your project under .github called Copilot instructions. You will need to tell it in settings to use this, but you can give it some examples of, this is some additional information I always want to send up to Copilot chat. So in this case, we've said, used some of these techniques we've talked about where we've said, be specific about what we want, only in a reusable React component, and given an example of what it looks like. We've even asked it to add tests where appropriate, so I probably didn't need to specifically ask it to do tests. But by adding this to the project itself, everybody who's using that project, who's working on that project, will have those applied. If you have suggestions that you want just for yourself, like you prefer really succinct answers, or you would prefer it to respond to you in a different language, you can do that by adding them to your user settings too. So in Visual Studio Code, in your personal settings, you can add instructions for you specifically as well. So that's another feature which I love and I use very liberally, as you can see. Okay, I'm going to jump back really quickly to StreamYard just to make sure that there's any other questions just before we close out. I realize we are late in time. Sorry, Anna. All right, Robot, if we're trying out different AI code assist extensions tools, can we set up VS Code to sandbox profiles to only use Copilot in one profile and say another tool when we switch to a different profile? That's an excellent question. I certainly know that you can tell Copilot to turn on and off, in particular repositories and folders, file types and things like that as well. I don't know whether you can tie it specifically to a profile. If it's a VS Code profile, probably the easiest way to do it would be just to not have the Visual Studio Code extension, so the Copilot extension for that profile. But yeah, something like that. How can we use GitHub Copilot for reverse engineering from Bernard? How about upgrading the version of solutions? So yeah, the problem with upgrading a large projects is there's a lot of things to change. So Copilot edits can certainly help you there. But if you need to kind of make changes to 1,000 files, it's really not going to be able to do that in a meaningful way because it's just too much information. There's a couple of other things you can try. Copilot Workspace, which I think is available if you're in Copilot Enterprise. Not entirely sure about that licensing, but Copilot Workspace, which you can do from github.com, lets you kind of start with an issue or start with a task, and it will try and apply that across the entire project. That's similar-ish in behavior to Copilot Edits, but a bit more kind of feature complete. You can have brainstorming sessions with AI and things like that as well. But upgrading that version is one of those things. We've also been experimenting with a tool called, I can't remember what it's called, but it uses Copilot under the covers to upgrade. In this case, it's just a Java upgrader. And it does this kind of loop of making changes and then building and looking at the errors and then using those errors to inform what it needs to change in the code. And it keeps going through that loop, stops if it needs human interaction, and then tries to upgrade the entire project. So that's still being experimented on, but that's something we've heard for sure. Copilot, yeah, sorry. With the model picker, do we have to have an API key for Claude or access to that? No, we do all of that server side. So we have access to our own implementations of that or our own access to Claude. That's just part of your Copilot subscription. So no additional API keys or anything like that for either of those. And then Copilot instructions borrow straight from Copilot. Yeah, some of these features kind of seem obvious, I guess, once we start doing them. So the instructions is an example. Extensions and participants and things like that, you could argue came from chat, but a lot of these kind of features are things that the community wants, and so we implement them. So yeah, I wouldn't say that we completely copied it, but I can see that that's something that they do, and we also do that as well. So awesome. I realize I am short on time, so I am going to wrap up. Hopefully this was useful. Once again, that gh.io/copilot, sorry, what was it? It was prompt engineering. Yeah, that is a really good resource for just tips and tricks while you're using Copilot. But really, the more context you can give it, the better. The more precise you can be with your instructions, the better, and make use of the participants and the extensions and things like that. They can be really, really powerful. And with that, I'm going to let you all go back to your day. Thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you later.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thanks to our speaker. The session is a part of a series. To register for future shows and watch past episodes on demand, you can follow the link on the screen or in the chat. We're always looking to improve our sessions and your experience. If you have any feedback for us, we would love to hear what you have to say. You can find that link on the screen or in the chat. Today's event code is 23687, and we will see you at the next one.